So, beloved, today in Advent is the Sunday of joy, which can be an awkward thing to say because joy is kind of a complicated visitor. We don't always know what to do with her when she shows up. She shows up unannounced sometimes, maybe a laugh that doesn't quite seem to fit the setting. Sometimes she shows up in the doorway of the Collins Street Bakery, or in the sounds of small voices, uncertain, arriving in a fairly empty and grand entryway to a nearby nursing home. And she, Joy, asks us to notice her even when the setting doesn't seem right, even when the world feels threadbare, trembling. And friends, the world does continue to tremble. I turned on my TV last night before I went to bed and saw news of more shootings. One at Brown University, one on Bondi Beach in Australia. 2 among far too many. And of course, wars continue. The names of the grieving only multiply. In our own congregation, we carry stories of grief and exhaustion, aging loved ones, chronic and unexplained illnesses, all things that can feel a little bit heavier in December than they did last summer. So when we arrive at Joy Sunday, we aren't arriving with hands full of confetti. We are arriving with tired knees from praying, with worn out eyes from searching, maybe from crying. And maybe, just maybe, this is exactly what Isaiah and Jesus had in mind. Today is the Sunday of joy, and our theme, one many of us learned long before we ever understood it, the theme that has become the sermon title, comes from Nehemiah. The joy of the Lord is my strength. I remember being a kid in Vacation Bible School, and that was one of the verses that we were taught to memorize. The joy of the Lord is my strength. You may be thinking, but we didn't read Nehemiah. No, Nehemiah is not a story of people who felt joyful. It's a story of people who were displaced, exhausted, traumatized. They were coming home, having been cast out exiles. They were finally coming home and finding their home in ruins, rubble. They were trying to rebuild when they hardly had the energy even to stand up. Nehemiah is a book where the people weep when scriptures are found in the rubble and read out loud. Not because they are sentimental, but because they realize how far they've fallen away from their old life, how broken things are, how much trauma and grief they are carrying. And into that moment, Nehemiah says, "Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." Not your joy, God's joy. God's delight in you, just where you are. God's presence with you and in you. God's faithfulness. Remember Reagan when she read, always faithful, forever faith. God's faithfulness is holding you. Some days that sounds like a promise. Some days it might feel like a reach. And some days like this week, especially with those shootings and wars ongoing, grief that is still raw in our own congregation family, it feels like a prayer that we maybe desperately want to believe. Because we don't arrive here at Joy Sunday with uncomplicated hearts or unmessy lives. We arrive with tiredness, with tenderness, with lives that might feel more like Isaiah's wilderness than like the blossoming desert. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why the joy of the Lord is our strength, and exactly when the joy of the Lord becomes our strength, when we are worn. Isaiah 35 begins not with cheerful people, but with exhausted ones. He speaks of weak hands, hands that in Hebrew, raphot, are hands that literally are too weak to hold on. They let go. Hands that can no longer carry what they once used to manage. And he also speaks of weak knees. In Hebrew, that is koshalot. And those mean knees that buckle under weariness, not under some kind of moral failure. The people that Isaiah is addressing are not triumphant. They are depleted, exhausted. They've been working at this so long. And into that feeling of exhaustion, of wondering if we're ever going to get there, Isaiah delivers God's command that God will strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. And listen to this grace. God is not telling the weary to strengthen themselves, because in the Hebrew, you don't notice it in the English, but in the Hebrew, the verb subject shifts. God is the one who is lifting. God is the one who is steadying. God is the one who is restoring. They are not strengthening themselves by faith. God is doing the work. And God is the one who builds up the holy way, a raised up road where even the stumbling can walk without fear of losing their way. This is the first whisper of today's theme, the joy of the Lord is my strength. Not because I feel joyful, but because God strengthens where my joy runs thin. So today, the gospel message comes out of a jail cell. John is in a stone-cold jail cell. He's not out baptizing crowds, but sitting in the darkness. He's not thundering with certainty, but sending messengers with a trembling, honest, maybe even doubtful question. Are you the one, or should we expect another? This is not a question of a doubting skeptic. It's the question of a man whose world has collapsed. It's the question that we often whisper when our hope grows thin. And Jesus does not scold the question. He doesn't shame the exhaustion. He doesn't say, John, pull yourself together, you know it's me. Instead, he sends back the evidence that echoes the prophet Isaiah. He sends the disciples back and says, witness to him that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are restored, the deaf hear, the dead rise, and the poor receive good news. It's as if Jesus was saying, John, I know you're tired, but joy is still rising. Joy is also still healing. Joy is also still strengthening. We don't think about joy as doing healing work or as strengthening us when we are weak. But joy is God at work in our world. This is the joy Nehemiah spoke of. It's not a feeling, but a reliable activity of God. When we hear the joy of the Lord is my strength, we can imagine maybe some kind of spiritual pep rally cheerfulness going on, a smile that's supposed to make everything better. That's kind of what the world thinks of as joy. But biblical joy is not cheerfulness. Biblical joy is strength for the weary. It's God's presence breaking into desolation, into jail cells and funeral homes, into all kinds of trouble where we might find ourselves. Biblical joy is the desert blooming. I happened to not read my own devotional this morning until I got to Sunday school. And then when I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is so how God is stitching everything together. Because what I was thinking about then, when I was writing it, was something that I had just seen in the news. I don't know if you all remember this. It was back in October, and it was called Desierto Florido. Did I say that right? Anybody who speaks Spanish? What does that mean? Desierto Florido. That was in Chile's Atacama Desert. You remember, there were pictures on the news of this vast desert land, which would look exactly as you expect. Sand and scrubby, brushy, dead-looking things all across. And then just one morning, they woke up. There had been a rain. They woke up the next morning, and that whole landscape, like every bit of the camera, was filled with yellow and pink and orange flowers. And it was the same place that had been the desert. That's what biblical joy is like, the desert blooming. Biblical joy is the holy way When he talks about the holy way, we often talk about the highway, making the path straight. And I'm not sure how we think of it always, but as I'm studying this, I recognize that this holy way is rising up under tired feet and lifting them up so that they are above danger, so that they can have no doubt as to the direction they need to go. Have y'all ever been to Yellowstone? It reminded me, Yellowstone, where you have all the geysers and the swamps and the geothermal things that you're not supposed to step on. The ground looks like ground, but there are people who have stepped off the path that have found out that it was not a safe place to walk. So those raised boardwalks are a lifted highway to make it safe for us to walk all over Yellowstone and see the majesty. It's clearly marked. It's a steady path. It raises us above dangers. Biblical joy is like a pathway that lifts us up and helps us get where we need to get without falling into danger. Biblical joy is Jesus answering a doubting question with healing instead of judgment. Because Jesus knows that doubt is not a barrier to belief, but a doorway to compassion, and often a doorway to even deeper healing. Biblical joy is good news, continuously poured into the poor. In Greek, the word that we hear as evangelism, evangeli, that is carrying good news. It is a present tense Greek word that means they are continuing. So they are being good newsed over and over and over again. The way, my real life example of that is the way joy shows up through a teacher who I know keeps showing up to school every day with extra snacks and books and encouragement for her students because she knows that her students' needs will not be met once they get home. She offers not a one-time event of good news, but a rhythm of it. They know that they can expect to have snacks and treats, books. That is evangelizing. That is good newsing the least of these over and over again. That is biblical joy. And that's what God does. And because of that, that kind of joy is what we do. We don't have joy, we do joy. We participate in it. And that's when it becomes strength for us, when God's joy becomes our strength. We've seen that strength ourselves several times this week, I think. We saw it in choir and bell rehearsals and meals prepared for others, in prayers that were spoken in quiet hallways and behind curtains in rooms of an ER, in handmade gifts often offered without fanfare from a plastic bag. This is not escapist joy. This is strength-giving joy. It's Isaiah's desert bloom joy. It's Jesus's good news, good news, good news joy. And it's often discovered not in the absence of our sorrow, not when we finally are getting things right, because, newsflash, that doesn't tend to happen in this life. It comes to us in the middle of our sorrow and our mess and our frustration and our wishing for things to get better. If you are exhausted today, the joy of the Lord can be your strength too. Not because you have to muster it, but because God is already at work in your exhaustion. If your hands feel weak, God strengthens them. If your knees are trembling from so much prayer, God steadies them. If, like John, you're asking hard questions from an even harder place, God honors them and meets you with compassion and healing, not judgment. The joy of the Lord is not a demand, it is a gift. It's not loud, it doesn't trample over our sorrow. It walks with us, lifting us up on a holy path at our own pace. It lifts what we cannot lift by ourselves. It holds what we cannot hold by ourselves. It carries what we cannot carry by ourselves. The joy of the Lord is our strength, because the presence of God is in us. So please don't confuse joy with confetti and noise. Don't confuse joy with denial of pain and sorrow. Don't confuse joy with pretending that everything's okay. Instead, remember that joy is a quiet miracle. It is God creating life where we don't think it's possible, where it might have been called barren. Joy is much more a defiant whisper that violence and despair are not going to have the last word. Joy is something that pours into our hearts when we think we have nothing left. Joy is God's strength in you, for you, and through you. So today, receive that gift of joy, not as cheerfulness, but as strength. Strength to rise, strength to hope, strength to walk that holy way, strength to believe that even now, God is good newsing the world over and over again through our hands, through our smiles, through our service. So, no matter what the circumstance, know that God's joy will feed you and nourish you and strengthen you until all the world knows God's joy. Amen.